Good evening. Our topic tonight is spiritual bypassing and mental health for Gnostics and Esotericists. We mentioned a few weeks ago the renewed interest in mental health issues in the United States and raising some interesting questions for Gnostics and Esotericists. We think that these questions deserve some attention, and we wanted to dedicate a whole show to them. Bishop Peterson, how are you?
I am wonderful, Bishop Canterbury. How are you?
I'm doing well. Well, we've had this guest on before, but I would like you to introduce him because I know you guys are close friends.
We are. I'm delighted to welcome back Alan Salmi. Alan Salmi is a licensed clinical social worker, astrologer, and esotericist living in the Chicago area. Welcome, Alan.
Welcome back, Alan.
Yeah, it's great to be back here.
It's wonderful to have you back. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show on such short notice. We really appreciate it.
Sure
When you were on the show last year, it was close to a year ago that you were first on the show, and the topic of the show was therapists for esotericists, and we talked a little bit about the challenges for Gnostics and esotericists and people in alternative spiritualities, the challenges of finding appropriate mental health care, noting that in some cases therapists might be dismissive of a person's spiritual pursuits, and that can sometimes get in the way of effective treatment. So but with this show, we're kind of playing devil's advocate, or kind of flipping back on that. We're looking at the issue of the idea of spiritual bypassing, which is a situation in which people might overlook very real physical, behavioral, and mental health issues by over-spiritualizing them. And I want to use a definition that I found from an author named Robert Augustus Masters. He says in an article, spiritual bypassing, a term first coined by psychologist John Wellwood in 1984, is the use of spiritual practices and beliefs to avoid dealing with our painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. And the title of an article by Masters on the topic includes the phrase, spiritual bypassing is avoidance in holy drag. Can we start maybe just talking a little bit about the concept and the idea of avoidance?
Okay. You know, I think the nice thing about avoidance is that everyone really is familiar with it.
Yeah.
I mean, in many senses, it's not something that is too pathological for most people. Most people have this sense of, okay, there's some kind of stress and I don't want to deal with it. You know, anybody who has ever not done their taxes for a period of time, okay, would be somebody doing that kind of avoidance. But it is a way of coping. Now, the problem is when it becomes maladaptive, when the avoidance starts to be too much and there are consequences to it. If you think about it, you're looking at a stressor and putting it into a part of your mind, putting it away from your mind, and that can come back to really bite you in the rear. The major difficulty with that is the same difficulty in many senses in the spiritual path of not looking at yourself. Okay. And I think that that's when things start to cascade and create problems. Now, in the worst cases, the psychiatric manual actually has a personality disorder called avoidant personality disorder. I'm not much on those kinds of labels, but I would use more descriptive terms as to what's happening to any one person. But if it gets up to that level, then the avoidance starts to take over everything, and you start to shut down in all of your functioning. But keep in mind, there are ways of avoiding things that can also be healthy. You know, for instance, some of the articles that are out there, they talk about meditation or relaxation techniques as ways of coping that some of the research has shown is positive. Well, of course, those fall into our category of being spiritual practices also. The problem is when those practices start to become unbalanced, you know, and you start then having the consequences to them. It's a pretty common thing, though. I mean, a lot of people, especially when they first get into any kind of spiritual path, you know, they have that enthusiasm of the recent convert or the investigating and all the rest. But I've seen cases where it can be very, very difficult. I had a guy with extreme pain in one arm who insisted that he was experiencing intense energy there. You know, and everything that he was doing was, he had the most remarkable ability to jump to the cosmic level to avoid dealing with the issues that he was having, you know. Unfortunately, that was very early in my career.
Yeah.
And he was really challenging to work with. And I think I did him some good, but not as much as after having more than 20 years experience, I could certainly challenge him more. There are some therapies that actually work directly on that. The cognitive behavioral people are really good at confronting that sort of thing too.
Sure.
And some of the psychodynamic people too, they'll just look at that and start to pull it apart.
Yeah. I think, as I may have mentioned before, Deacon Michael Stroyan in the AJC has used the term, sometimes we take a microcosmic problem and we want to approach it at a macrocosmic level. And we forget that, yeah, you can, as above, so below, but you have to pay attention to where the issue really lies. And we sometimes don't want to face a hard truth, so we will choose to over spiritualize it. And I think that that's one of the things, one of the potential dangers of spiritual bypassing, is that while on one hand coping is one thing that can help you get by day to day, but if you've got a real concrete problem, that may not go away.
Right.
And by over spiritualizing it. So all the meditation in the world may not address the fact that you need to get your taxes done.
Right.
Indeed.
Yeah. And so I think about, so I've encountered this a lot, I think, in our community, where people will choose to ignore feelings that they have, desires that they have, and they repress them rather than working through them. And all claiming to be spiritual. Like a person might, for example, be in a state of financial ruin. They have no money. They're constantly stressing about money, but then they will repress any inclination that they have to change their condition by casting their condition as some kind of spiritual poverty that is that's important to their development, when in fact they're driving, they're harming themselves. But they can't. Yeah, but they've chosen to over spiritualize this. And usually, when people choose to life of spiritual poverty, they actually join a monastic order that has a system set up for that. And,
you're actually reminding me of somebody who, even when they did the magic to solve their problem, because they were so intent on a spiritual solution, they didn't see the practical solution that was handed to them. It was somebody who was in dire straits. They did some magical work, and somebody came by and said, look, I can help you to sell your house and all the rest and get everything out of the way. Well, that wasn't the solution they were looking for. Right. It was the one that Spirit apparently was giving them. And even then, boom, it still wasn't something that was getting into their brain, Yeah.
So. And that happens a lot, and there's some real damage there when a person can't even see the concrete effects of their own esoteric or magical work. They're so avoidant. They're even avoiding the positive consequences of their own work, and that's a real issue there. They've kind of really painted themselves into a corner, and actually they've turned around to face it as well. Right. They're choosing not to see anything.
One way of looking at all of this is a very simple parts model, which I use at times. It's that some part of you is so scared and so desperate that it leads you away from looking at what's really going on, and those parts can take over. In some traditions, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism, they consider them demons. There's a wonderful book, by the way, called Feeding Your Demons by Lama Siltra Malioni. I did 2 weeks of training with her, and she talks about that, that there are all these different things which keep us from our spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that kind of avoidance is a coping mechanism from some part of you. I really think that there is the real you that is aware of what's going on, but sometimes that real you can be so pushed back by the parts that are trying to cope in these negative ways that it's hard to get in touch with that real you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that, and it's interesting. I've brought this up before on other shows that there have been a few esoteric practitioners over the years who have basically said that people who want to go on this path actually ought to try psychotherapy first.
Mm-hmm.
To try and face some of their issues before attempting a spiritual path, simply because if you start on this path in a compromised position, you can end up really messing things up even further for yourself.
Sure. Well, the most famous of those was Israel Regardie. He
Yeah.
wouldn't work with anybody unless they'd been in analysis for a year. You know?
Yeah.
And the order that I belong to, during one of your degrees, we use an elemental system. In water degree, you're expected to look at some of your issues in either in therapy or even a 12-step group or something like that to be able to confront and work with some of these things, because otherwise that can spiral out of control and into the entire group too.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of group work, what occurred to me when I was working on the notes for this show is that spiritual bypassing can work in different ways for different people. For example, a group leader might fall prey to engaging in abusive behavior by arguing that the abuse that they are handing out, or the manipulations, or the exploitation that they're putting out, dealing out, is in fact necessary for the spiritual development of their students, and they will overlook that they are engaging in very bad behavior on the grounds that it's good, that's for the greater good of the students. And then, of course, what happens is the students, the ones that are willing to, who don't have appropriate boundaries set up and who can't defend their boundaries at all, may fall into the cycle that the abuse that they're getting is for their own spiritual good, that they are enduring this abuse and bad treatment, and their feelings of resentment or fear or anger are inappropriate. Their spiritual mission is to endure all this, conquer all that, and you end up with both sides feeding each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where you get this. If you start looking at it from that parts perspective, the parts of the two people are interacting in a vicious cycle. Okay. If you have a leader who can step out of that and literally be outside the box to look at the bigger picture, okay, then they can start to be more elegant in the work that they do. One of the things, though, that this does tread on, which is a very difficult topic, is what about those really advanced spiritual teachers who are sort of the crazy wisdom traditions?
Yeah.
You know, because certainly Gurdjieff was tough on some of his students. In the Tibetan tradition, Milarepa went through tremendous things. His teacher had him just dig huge holes and then fill them up and dig another one, you know, to burn off karma. But the thing is, most of us are not going to be exposed to teachers at that level.
Right.
You know, and that's the thing. If the teacher keeps saying that they're at that level, you may want to wonder. You know, I think that one of the things that is a good sign of a positive teacher is their own attitude of, look, we're all bozos on this bus, and, you know, I've got to do my own work also. You know, and that's been one of the good things that I've seen in some teachers. They go into analysis periodically, or they confront things or whatnot. You know, is the teacher themselves admitting to their own foibles and difficulties? Otherwise, they can get into these parts that will put up barriers and arrogance, and we get, you know, somewhat of what we've seen in recent tragedies in the pagan community, for instance.
Yes.
You know, with one of the major leaders being arrested for child pornography. You know.
Wow.
Yeah, that was very difficult. And then the whole thing with Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Yes.
boy, if you want to start looking at some difficult and heart-wrenching kinds of processes and things,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult, and it's hard, especially as a beginner. I think that people who are just getting into things have to be very careful about their teachers and to look. Fortunately, one of the things that I recommend looking up is PEI Bonowitz did something called the ABCDEF. I think the Advanced Bonowitz Cult Danger Evaluation
Yes.
Framework. And you can actually find that online and see, you know, how does the teacher not take any jokes about themselves? Are they, you know, how invasive are people into the spiritual life of things, and trying to control you in minimal ways? That can be a pretty good guideline to start looking at some of that.
Sure. Kind of wrapping back around to the issue of the individual, how does an individual distinguish, we have to make this brief, but how can an individual distinguish between a spiritual growing pains and spiritual bypassing?
I think the biggest thing is, are they willing to look at their own stuff? You know, are they using techniques that more numb them down or jump to looking at it from a cosmic perspective, as we said earlier, or are they willing to look at themselves and do the difficult work and maybe have a bad feeling every once in a while, you know? Okay.
Yeah.
If you're so avoidant that you can't do that, you know, I've seen versions of, well, I talked about the fellow earlier. I knew somebody some years ago who was so white light and bunnies, you know, that they didn't realize their own negative processes that was leaving stuff behind and insulting people and all the rest. And the odd story about that was they formed a sex cult, and one of their complaints was that nobody wanted to have sex with them, even in you know, even in the midst of that, because people were so they knew that this person was in fact spiritual bypassing and not looking at their own stuff. They didn't want that energy.
Yeah, understandable. Bishop Canterbury, do you have any questions?
Well, this has been interesting, and I think most of what I have, let's continue for the podcast. I know that we're running a little short on time right now. I think, although I do want to ask our audience, you know, how have you encountered spiritual bypassing in your own practice? And if you feel comfortable, please share in our comments, both on YouTube as well as on Facebook. I think this could lead to some interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Alan, how can people get in touch with you if they're interested in your services as an astrologer, or if they're local in Chicago interested in therapy?
Yeah, actually, I've been doing some coaching over the telephone too, so just about anywhere. My website is real easy. It's my name, alansalmi.com. I bought it, ALANSALMI.com. And you can also use that as an email, alan@alansalmi.com. So that's pretty easy.
Well, thank you. We're going to continue this discussion in the After Dark podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, after we do these video shows, we get together with our guests and we have a discussion, further discussion about the topics in the show. She'll last about an hour, so it's a meatier discussion and we can get more in depth. We can also get very silly, and occasionally my pets or Bishop Canterbury's pets make their appearances, so it's always a good time. And you can actually sometimes, if you are a Patreon supporter and you financially support this show, you are able to sit in on the taping of the After Dark podcast. You can actually see us in a much more casual atmosphere, recording the podcast. If you are interested in being able to do that, you can support us by going to Patreon, patreon.com/Gnostic, and pledging a small amount of money per video or podcast. And you can absolutely cap your contribution each month, but every penny that we raise through the Patreon system goes to support these broadcasts for you, podcasts, and all the work of the Gnostic NYC network. And oh, by the way, last week After Dark, our week's After Dark podcast is online at talkgnosis.gnosticnyc.com. Our video show didn't run due to technical problems, so we apologize for that, but you can listen to our topic, the discussion we had last week on the After Dark podcast. Also, I would say that if you do need mental health care, and you're unable to access it locally, there are some resources in the United States that can help you. Mentalhealth.gov is the federal government's website that can provide you with some information and leads to services. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, is another resource for you. And if you are in crisis or somebody you know is in crisis, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, suicidepreventionlifeline.org, can also provide you with immediate help as well as references to local organizations in your community. So I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Please feel free to leave your comments under the YouTube video or send us an email at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com or join us on our Facebook page. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.